Hi, it's Elisabeth Hancock, host of the Great Awakening podcast. Lately, I've been seeing a lot of really tall people, and also children seem to be getting taller. So, the people that I've seen over the past couple of years have reached possibly even 7 feet. They've been so tall, towering over everyone. And it's really got me thinking about the giants. So, where do giants fit into our history? Well, remarkably, there have been thousands of giant bones, skeletal remains found all across the world. And even more incredibly, they've managed to be whisked away and hidden from our collective consciousness. Of course, there are many of us now beginning to explore this and talk about the giant skeletal remains, but they're still being blocked on mainstream media. In particular, the Smithsonian Institute, who talks about there being people around 7 feet tall, but doesn't talk about the giant remains that have been found, maybe even going up to 36 feet tall. Giants are talked about in our myths a lot. And we've always put our myths down to being not true. But that's not actually the case. Myths and legends are based on some form of truth. And they've been lost over time, if you like. The information has been lost over time and it's become a myth or a story or a fairy tale. But I think that there's a lot of truth in our myths. And one of those that we're now beginning to see is giants, because these bones are now beginning to be talked about and discussed. There are hundreds of videos on YouTube showing these skeletal remains. There are so many photos around, but most of the bones have now been hidden from sight or sold to the highest bidder, or the Smithsonian Institute has them. The Smithsonian Institute, which is said to be the archaeological arm of the FBI, has been given many of these bones over the decades to study and have apparently lost most of them or have denied knowledge of them. So it means that this is one of those areas that is still being put into the conspiracy theory. However, like most conspiracy theories, we're now beginning to understand that they're not conspiracy theories. They're just areas of research where we are supposed to not look. And personally, I hate taboo areas. I don't see why we can't be open-minded and be able to talk about anything and everything. I don't see why we have to have subjects that are not allowed to be on the table. So the fact that I've been seeing more and more tall people, and it's obvious that children are getting taller. You only have to look at the kids in school, even my own kids, they're just towering over all of us. Which makes me think, have we interbred with the giants? Well, I suspect that we have, and there's quite a bit of evidence to show that this DNA is in our DNA. So somewhere along the line, we were breeding with, living with the giants, whoever they were. Maybe we were all giants ourselves, and we have been genetically downgraded so many times over the centuries that we ended up just becoming smaller and smaller. And the researcher Sasha Stone talks about this. He believes that we have been genetically downgraded, and if you like, downgraded into a smaller, weaker version of what we were before. And there's so much evidence to show that these giants were a huge part of our society that I suspect that this was us, an earlier version, if you like. I talk about the Great Reset a lot. And if our world has been indeed reset every 250 years, it means that each new world, each new reset is going to look different from the one before. We talked about Tartaria a lot when I was interviewing Guy Anderson, but the Tartarian Empire were also said to be consisting of tall, red-haired people with white skin, light-colored eyes. And of course, these are the Slavs. So this Tartarian Empire, which although stretched across the entire globe, it seemed to have its main roots around Russia and Mongolia. And these people, there have been skeletal remains found in these areas that show these people, called the Trocharians, were indeed tall, red-haired, with white skin. We also have the Bible, which talks a lot about giants, especially in Genesis, where they're referred to as the Nephilim. In the book of Enoch, it refers to the watchers coming down from heaven and mingling their seed with the women of the earth, evidencing that these watchers were able to interbreed with humans, again showing that we're all part of this same human DNA. The human DNA I talked about last week that can go back 9 billion years. So humans or human DNA has been around for 9 billion years. It means that we've spread across the entire galaxy. The Indian Vedas talk about 400,000 different humanoid species just in this galaxy alone, which shows that there are many humans. Some of them look like us, probably many of them, and some of them look like varied versions of us, but still in a humanoid form. This, I feel, explains why we are so different as a species, because we cross many different species, but we all have the common denominator, which is human DNA. So these Nephilim were the children of the watchers who interbred with the human females. And interestingly, Nephilah translates to children of Orion. So maybe these watchers were from Orion. And of course, many of our sacred sites point to Orion. They came down from the sky, as it's talked about in the book of Enoch, and they interbred with the human females. These human females could also have been genetically altered females to look more like the Anunnaki and genetically altered from either Homo erectus or Neanderthal, who we also know wasn't an ape. The human DNA, the human line has originated on its own, but there are so many genetic alterations, genetic engineering within our species that we're not too sure what our original form looks like. However, these Anunnaki were very tall and were said to be up to 8 foot tall in the Sumerian tablets of the Enuma Elish. The Egyptian building texts, which are very interesting, also talk about these half gods, half humans as being very tall, especially Gilgamesh, who is described as being 2/3 god and 1/3 human, whilst in the Book of Giants, he's described as being a giant. And I suspect that a lot of these myths, they're talking about advanced technology that our ancestors, or one bloodline of our ancestors, because I think we're many different bloodlines, they were not able to describe what they were seeing. It looked like magic to them. But now with the introduction of quantum physics, we can see that quantum physics is magic. So a lot of the things I think they were able to do was because they were able to harness and tap into the field of energy and probably consciousness as well, which I'm beginning to think is probably plasma. So what do I mean by giant? Well, most giants, or the skeletal remains that have been found, average around 7 to 8 feet. And this links with the people that I've seen who are definitely around 7 feet tall. So this seemed to be the normal standard. We know that the Anunnaki were said to be 8 foot tall. So 7 to 8 foot tall. And most skeletons have been measured around that level. But we also have a full skeleton that was measured to be 22 feet tall, found on the island of Tongariro in 1967. At the same time when the archaeologists discovered this skeletal remains, they also found urns underneath it. And when they tried to take the urns, a loud booming voice came from a nearby lagoon telling them to put them back. They, of course, hurriedly put them back and never went back again. And I keep asking myself, who is this? Could this be the mer people? Could this be the people living under the sea in the different globes that we talked about in a previous episode? Or could it be something coming from the sky, or maybe something entirely different? Who knows? But it's an interesting story. When I hear stories like this, it really makes me understand that not only are we not alone in this multiverse, but we're not alone on this planet either. And I suspect that we share this planet with a wide variety of humanoid species that for some reason they're staying away from us. There are also reports of many skeletal remains, many of them found with red hair, from New Zealand. And there's even a report of one being that was found to be 24 feet tall with a skull the size of a large pumpkin. And according to stories reported by sailors visiting these islands, there were giants living there right up until the 18th century. And there are pictures, images of these incredibly tall people. And as I said, hundreds of skeletal remains have been found in New Zealand, but everything has either been destroyed or taken away. For example, an entire cave of giant remains with red hair was discovered, but the cave was blown up with dynamite and the dust and fragments given back to the indigenous tribes to rebury. And more bones were discovered on Mount Karioi, which actually means the mountain of red-haired giants. These were genetically tested, and it shows that the genome was originally from Wales in the UK and dated to 2500 BC. In England, we have a lot of myths and legends around giants, not least King Albion, who is said to be a mythical king, and part of the Arthur and Guinevere story, which I don't think was myth. I think that they were also a real king and queen that existed. They were possibly part of the Tartarian Empire. And King Albion was the leader of a tribe of giants who also had white skin and red hair. So again, we've got that same theme with the white skin, the red hair, and the large size frame, the giant frame. And these giants in England are said to be responsible for all the monoliths. They essentially created these huge monoliths. They were able to move stone around, and they also were said to have levitation skills as well, which I think is sound frequency. Sound can levitate physical matter, which we'll look at next week when we come to the Bosnian pyramids, because the levitation frequency has been found there as well. But it's showing that this levitation frequency, they possibly were able to use this, again showing advanced science, advanced technology, frequency technology, and that they were able to tap into this to be able to build these huge monoliths and move the stones, which were often moved from many, many miles away to the place where they wanted to put the stones. They used to put these stones on areas where many ley lines crossed over, and these stones contained high amounts of crystal, and it was the crystal interacting with the ley lines, the energy ley lines, that would then create some form of technology, or maybe even a place where they were able to cross between dimensions as portals. Because as we know, crystals, especially white quartz, which is in granite, crystals are transducers of energy. They magnify energy. So if you're putting them above an area where many energy ley lines cross, you're going to create some form of strong field, which is going to be used in some way, however they used it. There have also been thousands of giant bones found in North America. And amateur archaeologist Ralph Giddon found evidence of a race of American giants who are up to 9 feet tall on the island of Catalina, which is off the southwestern coast of California in 1919. More than 3,000 of these skeletons were found, all over 7 feet. And they even showed evidence of 6 fingers on their hands. And maybe that they were also all blue-eyed and blonde-haired, which is what Giddon believed. Other accounts point towards some of these skeletons having elongated skulls, but also, interestingly, some of them had protruding jaws with a face index remarkably low down. So low down like this, as in the nose and the bottom of the chin are low down. And when I read this, this reminded me of the Homo erectus look that we get. The skull of the Homo erectus, it's got this sort of protruding face that we say is very similar to an ape, and that's why we've evolved from an ape. But these skeletons, these people also had this same look as well. Some even had double rows of teeth, top and bottom, and the jaws were so large that they could fit over the heads of the people that discovered them, as well as being up to 18 feet tall. Interestingly, the burial sites where these giants were buried contained a lot of hieroglyphics and crystals and even weaponry, showing that they were fighting in some way. There's also the very famous case of the Lovelock Cave in the state of Nevada. Many of these giant skeletons around the world have been found with 6 fingers and toes. And when we think about the polydactyl disorder today, which, everything's called disorder, but, maybe they're not disorders. Maybe they are inherited from other species of the Homo family, who we have all interbred with. So the polydactyl trait or disorder, which is now said to affect 1 in 10 people, which is a huge amount. 1 in 10 people out of 8 billion people is a massive amount. So again, it's showing, is this really a genetic disorder, a genetic mutation that Mother Nature just suddenly popped out an extra finger on and toe? Or is it that we've actually interbred with these giants? Well, I think that we can see that we have interbred with these giants. And again, the Bible talks about the Nephilim who have 6 digits. Indeed, if we have interbred with these giants, that would explain the polydactyl disorder, it would explain red hair, it would explain the elongated skull, it would explain the people who are coming in at 7 feet. There are even people who've been living over the past 100 years who've been towering over 8 foot. And these are recorded normal people who have lived. And for some reason, again, it's not showing up in our history books. And yet there are many of them. We see the tallest man in the world who's recorded in the Guinness Book of Records, but we don't see any of these other people. So maybe Sacha Stone is correct, and maybe our genes were suppressed in order to stop the giant gene from manifesting. And now, as our genes are not being suppressed, this gene is switching back on and beginning to manifest and create taller children and people in the world again. The indigenous accounts I find really, really fascinating because I think they're telling us so much truth. And I think there's a reason why the indigenous people have been messed around with and treated so badly over the decades. And that's because they have the knowledge, they have the truth of what's happened on this planet, what's happened to us, and what is happening now, maybe. And in particular, the Wichita, the Hopi, and the Zuni tribes tell stories of their women breeding with these advanced, very tall people who they say had supernatural abilities and lived extraordinarily long lives. Only a few of their women survived giving birth to these huge babies who came out the size of grown infants. And although this breeding started well, as they grew in size, it led to barbaric and violent behavior by some of them, which we can also see talked about in the indigenous and even religious accounts, because the Bible also talks about these giants and how they were taking over the land and starting to dominate everything. And of course, the Bible talks about the flood as being created to wipe out these giants. So maybe the breeding between humans and possibly these watchers from Orion or Pleiades or wherever, maybe the interbreeding between them didn't work, and it created genetic deformities, it created problems, and it manifested into a violent and barbaric giant and started to create havoc in the world, which is what the Bible is telling us. We've also got many petrified stone, and this petrified stone actually covers a very wide area. It covers all sorts of animals, giants, humans, plants. Although petrification is said to take a long time, we now understand that it doesn't have to take a long time. And if the circumstances are right, petrification can actually happen very, very fast. And one of those circumstances is a flood. And we can see again this global flood that just keeps coming back and back. These stories about this, it's just everywhere. And again, this flood, which is documented as being 9,700 BC, it's the same flood that wiped out the civilization of Atlantis. And it's possibly the same flood that created all these petrified bodies. Many of these are giants. And Michael Tellinger, in his museum in South Africa, he has even had one of these petrified rocks validated by a heart surgeon who's confirmed that this rock is an exact replica of a heart with the same valves, aortas, and veins on it, showing us again that this petrification actually did occur, and much fauna and flora was wiped out with this flood and then petrified very fast after it because the conditions were right for that. And in the Solomon Isles, the residents who live there still say that they're sharing their island with giants who they say live underground in large interconnected caves and have been living there for thousands of years. They apparently even use a type of illuminating stone for light, which allows them to live underground, again showing that there is the possibility to live under the earth. We just haven't discovered what that is yet. And interestingly, again, in the story of Noah, with the great flood, who sealed themselves and all the animals inside the bitumen sealed boat, he was also said to have used this illuminating stone for light, because obviously they had blocked out all of the light. So I believe the answers are all there. The answers are there in our myths, our legends, and in our religious accounts, which I see as historical accounts of our world. And now is the Great Awakening, as all this information is flooding out into the world. And we're all beginning to understand who we are, remember who we are, and get back to the true human again, which we'll come to in future episodes. Okay. All right. Take care. Hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Take care. Catch up with you soon. Okay. Bye.